Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your invitation. As Catherine said, indeed, like the title of this afternoon panel is Getting the Message Across. And I hate to disappoint, but it seems to me that precisely talking about Jasper Johns is probably not an artist who is clearly getting the message across, which I will try to show. But at the same time, I want to start with the use of this print, the Flags one from 1973 on the cover of the catalog with the title The American Dream, because it suggests that the print has something to say, to tell us about the American dream after all, and probably that it's a bit sketchy or that it's not as neat as it's supposed to be. But at the same time, it would be a stretch to say or deduce that Johns is therefore a fully committed artist, politically speaking. It's more what we want him to say about the American dream that rather than whatever he wanted to say about it. And as Stephen Koppel reminds us in the introduction of the catalogue, Johns, after all, remained rather silent with regard to any political or social reading that his repeated depiction of the flag might imply. Not that as an individual he was oblivious of political matter, but as a painter, he was certainly nothing like a protest artist, or, as indeed I will try to show, only incidentally, if not at times accidentally. And the relationship between art and politics in Johns' work might be that of chewing gum and glue. To use his own terms, his own words, I quote him, "If you make chewing gum and everybody ends up using it as glue, whoever made it is given the responsibility of making glue, even if what he really intends is chewing gum." So talking about the flags, I think that we always know where to start with Johns' flag, with the 1954-55 painting that was exhibited early in 1958 for the first time at the Leo Castelli Gallery, and it's the painting that Johns famously dreamed of painting. I quote him briefly as a reminder. One night, and it's more than once, it's the 1970 interview with Emile D'Antonio. One night I dreamed that I painted a large American flag, and the next morning I got up and I went out and bought material to begin it. Yet, as much as we know where to start, it's much more difficult to figure out where to stop. And his body of work unfolds with what seems to be an endless stream of variations on the flag. I, of course, will show some very obvious one, the variations in paintings, and here in three-dimensional paintings, or 2.x dimension, I don't really know. So from 58, variations in drawings, but after all, rather unorthodox technique, if we talk about drawings. On the right, you see that it's ink on plastic, and it's a variation that is a drawing after the painting that you see on the left, which makes actually the drawing, if we call it a drawing, it makes rather the painting preliminary to the drawing rather than traditionally the other way around. There are also variations of a two-dimensional painting in what Johns himself called kind of sculpture, in bronze or in lead. And so to come back to the print that is exhibited downstairs, a variation in prints from 73 here, derived from a painting from the same year, which was, of course, a painting which in itself was a variation on the flag, right? And if you, I didn't find a good enough reproduction of the painting from which this print is derived, but you'll see, looking at the print, that the left side, the right flag has a layer of varnish that makes it a little glossy, when the left side doesn't, which is a way in print to translate the difference in the original painting between the use of an encaustic on one side and oil on the other. And there is also here a black and white version of the print that you've seen before, which you could say that, I mean, I don't have the pointer, it doesn't work on that surface, but we are in fact looking at a variation on a variation on a variation, right? So there is this sort of bottomless process. So we could say that those are visual interpretations, in a sense, by Jones of his own art, each time reinterpreting it. And from that point of view, it seems rather clear that the medium and the way to handle it are in command of the meaning, as if the process and the making were somehow taking over the motif of the flag without cancelling it out. So in his own term, he is visibly interested in this tension, saying that the play between the image and the physical structure interests me, and as that changes, any description or perception of what the works is or means seems to change. So to a certain extent, we could say that the flag in Jones' work is more an object matter than a subject matter, an object matter that is undergoing endless experimental treatment. And that, from that point of view, if we call the flag a beautiful idea for Jones, it's a beautiful idea precisely because it is incomplete. But at the same time, in the 1960s, Jones was not the only one to interpret his own art and his flag, and Faith Ringgold, here with the painting, the flag is bleeding from 67, if I'm correct, took Jones' idea in a specific direction. And as she remembered, I quote her here, I was partially inspired by Jasper Johns Flags series. Yet, I also felt that Jones Flags presented a beautiful but incomplete idea. To complete it, I wanted to show some of the hell that had broken loose in the States, and what better place to do that than in the Stars and Stripes. So what she kept from Jones, it seems, is the possibility to identify the flag with the two-dimensional picture plane, and also actually keeping the outdated 48 stars regular grid, rather than adopting the 50 stars implemented in 1960. So Jones might have been inspiring for Ringgold in formal term, but in terms of content, she only saw his art as having a sort of unfulfilled potential, as she says, a beautiful but incomplete idea, in a sense a little bit like this 1966 cartoon suggests. She might have felt that from a political standpoint, Jones was rather on a safe ground, and that at that time, in the mid-60s, it was time to inject clear meaning into the artistic appropriation of the motif of the flag, which she did repeatedly, again here in 1969 with the moon flag Die Nigger. So it's very specifically following the landing on the moon and the flag raised, the American flag raised on the surface of the moon in July 69. And so you might not immediately see that, so there's in the stars in grayish dye, and if you tilt your head, you kind of decipher nigger in the stripes. So literally, in a sense, like to indicate the extent to which racism is embedded within the fabric of American society, so to say. So clearly, there is at that time a development of the use of the flag as a means of getting, indeed, the message across. Here, George Masiunas, a poster that was also included in Flux Kit with the message, I mean, the stars replaced by skulls, and the writing red on white that USA surpasses all genocide records, and not only a mention of Vietnam, but also of the massacre of Native American. So here, again, deprived of any ambivalence, in a sense. And another example here, Leon Golub, an unstretched painting, so in that sense, almost a flag, bloody, fleshy, that he called napalm flag, so sort of deliberate disfiguration of the flag of a country that has blood on its hand. So, by contrast, indeed, Jones' flag might possess a complex texture. It might have been, as he remembered and Leo Castelli remembered, controversial at the time, but at the same time, it did not steer any huge political controversy or polemics, or there are no clear record of them. And at best, it seemed of a time that we could say that, or it could be interpreted as sending rather a non-message. That's what Moria wrote in the late 70s in the article that she titled The Aesthetic of Indifference, where Jones, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, or central figure, she indeed suggests that there is a sort of a neutrality to Jones' flag. She wrote that Jones took the American flag and reduced it from a potentially emotional symbol to a passive, neutral object. And she concluded that Jones' flag was marking, I quote her, a deliberately apolitical and generally neutral stance. So in that same line, that was in 1977, in that same line, in the late 90s, Thomas Crow suggested that, again, like Jones had neutralized both the negative and positive authority of his motif. So I suppose that it means that the positive meaning being the patriotic, and the negative, the anti-American potential of the flag. So it's neither one nor the other for Thomas Crow, who concluded that for all its eccentricity, Jones' version of the flag offered little to any radicals hoping for open defiance by artists. So from that mid-60s and 70s and later perspective, it could be said that Jones had created a new challenge that would be how to paint a painting of the flag that would not be political. However, in one notable instance, Jones' flag served a specific cause. And that instance is the print, the moratorium print, an edition of 300 but that were turned later on into posters as well, commissioned by Leo Castelli in 1969 to advertise an exhibition that was intended to raise funds for the Moratorium Committee, the largest organized protest against the Vietnam War in the 60s. And interestingly, the exhibition did not contain any protest art. You see, among others, examples of works that were included here by Warhol, Flowers by Warhol, a highway landscape by D'Arcangelo, a single unit by Judd, and the sales proceeds would go to the Moratorium Committee. The principle of the exhibition is, in that sense, similar to, there was a talk who mentioned earlier, I think it was Suzanne, the Peace Portfolio gathering, actually, D'Arcangelo to Herbert Ferber, Adolf Gottlieb, Robert Rauschenberg, Motherwell, Lee Krasner, that you see on the left. And the logic was of the Peace Portfolio and its usefulness in political terms was explained by Harold Rosenberg in the introduction to the portfolio. And I think it's worth quoting a little bit that introduction. It's not too long, but it clarifies a little bit that relationship. I quote Rosenberg, "The art world," he starts, "has been in fury about the war in Vietnam, the police riots in Chicago, the shootings at Kent and in the South, to say nothing of the continuing vulgarity and deceit in high places. Unfortunately, what artists have wanted to say about the political situation, they have had to say in words. Their paintings would not speak for them. The politics, not in the works themselves, can be introduced by the way the works are disposed of. The sale of this portfolio is an instance of genuine artist-audience collaboration. Through it, art overcomes its silence by placing megaphones in the hands of peace candidates." So it's an interesting, to me, introduction because it shows how Rosenberg is, in 1970, visibly blind to the kind of protest art that, I mean, among others, I showed earlier. The simple idea that artists could express their dissent through art seems not even a possibility for him. And to come back to Moria Roth and her article from 1977 on the aesthetic of indifference, 7 years later, she concluded in that same article, I quote, "The radical politic movements of the 1960s had virtually no expression in the art of the time." So it's a sign that indeed it was rather invisible. And so for them, Jones' poster is something like an anomaly in a sense. And strangely, it's actually the most political work in that exhibition at the Leo Castelli Gallery in December 69. We could come back on the exhibition after the talk. So in this context, it has been interpreted, indeed, this poster, as loaded with meaning. I quote here Deborah Wood in the 1990s, who said that the colors are sickly representing an ailing America, and the black dot, which is actually white, that you see here, and the white dot looks like a bullet hole. And it is not rare, actually, to encounter that metaphorical reading of the dot. And after all, why not in this context of the moratorium? But most critics, at the same time, will have to acknowledge that this kind of metaphorical interpretation does not make sense in the context, in the broader context of Jones' work. Because as you see, in fact, the poster derives or is using a motif that was first used by Jones in the painting from 1965, but actually conceived it, thought of it as early as 64, describing it as intended to make a very ugly flag, but the purpose was not necessarily to make it just ugly. It was an optical trick and game, because you have on the top of the painting on the left the American flag with the reversed color, green, black, and orange. And if you fix your gaze on the white dot for a little while and look down at the raised rectangle at the bottom, you will see the flag in its actual color, the after image. So I never experienced directly the painting, but the print I did on the right, and indeed it works perfectly well, and you have a sort of ghostly image of the flag hovering in front and disappearing actually quite rapidly. So so the poster, after all, is just a use of that part of the painting or the print. So for that reason, in a sense, historians, critics, rightfully so probably, rejected the poster outside of the canon of Jones' work. Although the print had a vast impact in the political arena, wrote Deborah Wood, it is not representative of Jones' work. And for Richard Field, the existence of this poster in Jones' work is, in a sense, only conditional. I quote him briefly, saying that Jones allowed this part to be reproduced on the moratorium poster during the Vietnam War, but it is consonant with his philosophical acceptance of unintended uses and meanings once a work enters the public realm. So this philosophical acceptance is one thing, but clearly it came in for Jones at a price. And the price, he paid it in 1963 when Leo Castelli, his dealer, presented President Kennedy with one of his flag cast in bronze from 1960. And the accompanying letter with the flag, so you have the official photo of Castelli and Kennedy. So the work that is under his arm was accompanied by a letter where, interestingly, Castelli involved Jones, saying, "It is my pleasure to offer you and Mrs. Kennedy this flag of ours, rendered in bronze by Jasper Johns. It is one of 4 casts and was done in 1960. Both Jasper Johns and I are happy that we can thus express to you our gratitude and admiration." And Jones clearly, there is this sense that he did not express himself very often on politics, and only when he's asked, in a sense. But he reacted to that pretty strongly, saying that once I made kind of a sculpture of a flag in bronze. It was an edition of 3, I think. One of them was given on some occasion to President Kennedy. I became very upset that this was happening. It was given on Flag Day. It seemed to me to be such a terrible thing to happen. I complained bitterly to my very good friend John Cage. He said, quote, "Don't let it worry you, just consider it as a pun on your work." And more recently, actually, a journalist came back and talked about this event to Jones, who said, quote, "I thought it was the tackiest thing I'd ever seen." So it is clear that his philosophical acceptance of unintended uses and political uses has some limits. But also, his flag, and especially his negative colored flag, had some sort of a life of its own in the 60s. And one example, it seems to me, could be this flag that you see on the left by Donald Judd from around 1968. So could be 67, could be 69. And of course, there are very little, I mean, of course, I don't know, but I'm still waiting for more information from the Judd Foundation on that, because there is very little that I can tell you about this flag, except that it exists, that it's in the archives, that it was exhibited in 2011, and it is said to have been hung by Judd on the window of his studio. But if he did it for a specific occasion, if it was inspired more or less by Jones, I don't know. The only thing that I can notice is that, which does not really happen in Jones' work, but you see here that the stars are on the vertical flag are on the right, and the conventions want them to be on the left. So it's twice reversed, in a sense. The colors are reversed, but the orientation of the flag is wrong, according to the convention. And of course, like, mishandling the flag is something that was a very simple way to express political protest at the time. And actually, if there is little information about that flag by Donald Judd, what we know is that Yvonne Renner used it in 1970, in November, for a piece that was called War, where the dancers were following indications that were lifted from a military manual, like search and destroy, occupy, intercept, and she borrowed Judd's maybe Jones-inspired flag that you see is upside down and handled by the dancers on the right. So, in that sense, like almost without wanting it, the idea of this reversed color flag infiltrated a politically loaded piece. And that same year and same month, I'm sorry I didn't time, but I hope I'm on time. And this same month, you see here, Yvonne Renner contributed, using again the flag worn by the dancers here, for a last example that I will discuss this afternoon, which was the People's Flag show, organized precisely by Faith Ringgold, John Hendricks, and Jean Toche. And I quote the poster of the show that you see here on the right, with indeed a reversed flag, and a poster for the exhibition that was made by Faith Ringgold. And the exhibition was organized, I quote, as a challenge to the repressive laws governing so-called flag desecration. Concerned artists and citizens are asked to participate in an exhibition of flag works. To open with a symposium on repression, artists, it concluded, may not retain their conspicuous silence in times such as these. So the question is, of course, like, whether or not Jasper Johns was a concerned artist and citizens. Did he participate or not? And the question is actually simple but hard to answer. Yvonne Renner, for example, remembered again and again that Jasper Johns contributed to the exhibition, but no photographs show obvious signs of his work being used. And Roberta Bernstein, who is a specialist of Jones' works, in the mid-70s, talking to Jones and raising that issue, got as an answer that he did not participate to the exhibition. I don't have yet the final answer, but I think they are both right, actually. He did and did not participate. But the show, actually, and I will conclude briefly, was in support to, for a gallerist Stephen Radish, who had been prosecuted since 1966. The case lasted for years. I think it was not overturned until the mid-70s, because he had exhibited works by Mark Morrow, a sculptor who was a war veteran, and in 66, especially the work on the left started a big controversy. A policeman actually saw the work in the window of the gallery, and it all started through that. It's a lynched flag, right? A stuffed flag that is hung by the neck, and the case dragged over years, and when Radish in 1970 was convicted for desecrating the flag, the Faith Ringgold, Jean Toche, and John Hendricks organized that People's Flag Show in support of the gallerists. And so it was started the exhibition opened with a flag burning by John Hendricks and Jean Toche. On the right, you see Abby Hoffman, who gave a speech in his flag shirt. He was arrested in October 68. Faith Ringgold, that you see on the right, was opening the symposium on repression, and probably, but the event is not as well documented as you would expect, probably contributed with some of her flag paintings. And in terms of the American Dream, Kate Millett contributed with probably the masterpiece of the exhibition, The American Dream Goes to Pot, with the actual flag being flushed down the toilets. So, of course, this form of politically engaged manifestation, purposefully desecrating the flag, appears to be absolutely distinct from Jones' use of the flag. But I will conclude by a strange reversal maybe of the situation, because at that moment it is clear that Jones' flag, always coming back to the first, or you could say flags, but the first, it had established itself as a point of reference, a sort of a template, a norm against which any sort of artistic use of the flag would be judged. And it's what is happening in a letter that Sam Hunter wrote in 1970 in response to the People's Flag Show as a twisted defense of Mark Morell's art. And I will conclude by discussing briefly Sam Hunter's response. I quote, "In the light of cold logic, Morell's sculptures, on the left, is no more degrading to the flag than Wesselmann's Great American Nude series." There is an example that you could see in the exhibition. "And it is probably less subversive because less intense artistically than Jones' classic image, which made the flag disappear into an aesthetic object devoid of communal associations." So it is indeed a sort of weird ultimate reversal, right? While someone like Faith Ringgold found Jones' idea beautiful but politically incomplete, suddenly, out of cold logic, Jones' flag becomes more subversive than any protest art by the sheer virtue of its neutrality. Right? It's what I would call a bit twisted, rather than cold logic. And I think that rather than being cold, actually, Sam Hunter's logic is rather conservative in the end. What he cares about is not the potential power of art to protest or to challenge any dominant political order. What he fears most, after all, is that protest art may be a threat to art itself, art with a capital A. And in that context, the Jones flags becomes nothing more than a sort of alibi to defend art against protest art. So in the end, again, indeed, I don't think that, I don't know if Hunter's logic and discussion of Johns' flag fits in the philosophical acceptance of unintended uses of his flag. It may be just another instance of chewing gum used as glue. But to use Jasper Johns' words, it is certainly a tacky one. Thank you.